It was supposed to be just another weekend, ordinary in every way. I had visited my father countless times before, stayed in the same rooms, sat at the same table, moved through the same rhythms. The house was familiar, a place that carried the weight of memory and comfort. Yet that weekend, the familiar shifted. Something bent beneath the surface, and once I saw the fracture, I could never unsee it. I remember the moment with disturbing clarity. My father had gone upstairs to shave. I lingered in the living room, the quiet hum of the house pressing around me. It was the sort of silence that feels full rather than empty, like the air itself is listening. Then came the footsteps. They came from the room belonging to my stepsister. The sound was unmistakable, heavy, deliberate steps across the floor. At first, my mind reached for the obvious. She must be awake, restless, perhaps searching for something. I told myself there was no reason to feel unsettled, but unease settled in anyway. Something about the rhythm was wrong. Too measured, too deliberate. I waited for the sound to stop. It didn't. The pacing continued, steady and unhurried, circling like a trapped animal. My pulse quickened. My father came down the hall, catching the look on my face. He paused, listening. The footsteps carried on, louder now that we both acknowledged them. I saw his jaw tighten, the muscles in his face stiffen. He heard it too. We stood there for a long moment, frozen, before he moved to the door. My stepsister's room was closed, the handle cool to the touch. He pushed it open slowly. The sound ceased at once, cut off as though a switch had been thrown. Inside, the room was dark. My stepsister lay motionless in bed, her breathing slow and steady. She had not stirred, her body had not shifted. She could not have risen, walked, and returned to bed in the seconds before we entered. The silence in that room was suffocating. I scanned the corners, searching for movement, for explanation. Nothing. Just the steady breath of someone deeply asleep. My father said nothing, but his eyes betrayed him. He heard it too, and he could not explain it. That was only the beginning. The footsteps returned in the weeks that followed, sometimes at night, sometimes at dawn, always at the edge of silence when the house was at its most vulnerable. They rattled the ceiling fan in the living room, heavy enough to shake the air. My stepsister admitted she often woke from them, confused and frightened. She said the sound would circle above her room, heavy enough to drag her from sleep. Each time, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for acknowledgement.
It was not just the footsteps. The upstairs bathroom carried its own strangeness. I used it out of habit at first, but soon every visit filled me with dread. The sensation was unmistakable, the weight of eyes fixed on me, pressing between my shoulder blades as I showered. The feeling grew stronger each time until I rushed through with skin prickling, convinced that if I turned suddenly, I would find someone standing just behind me. Eventually, I stopped using it altogether. I told myself I preferred the downstairs bathroom, but the truth was simpler. I could not endure the constant sense of being watched. The realization that my father felt the same came unexpectedly. One evening, in a tone too casual to be casual, he asked if I had ever felt someone standing behind me in that bathroom. The question froze me. I answered carefully, but his eyes told me he already knew. He had felt it too, and he had carried that knowledge in silence until I confirmed it. After that, the house grew heavier. The silence felt charged, as if listening. Small details began to shift. A chair angled differently. A door left ajar that I was sure I had closed. A glass that had been empty, now half full. Always small, always deniable, but denial grows brittle when evidence repeats. Nights stretched long. I lay awake, waiting for the next sound. Silence no longer comforted me. It pressed down like weight on my chest. Each creak of wood, each whisper of air through the vents carried menace. I tried to tell myself, old houses move, pipes groan, wood contracts. But none of that explained the rhythm of footsteps, the feeling of eyes, the displacement of objects. Logic collapsed beneath repetition. One night, I stood in the living room staring at the ceiling. The footsteps began again, steady, deliberate. I counted them aloud, my voice trembling. 10 steps, a pause, 10 more. My chest tightened with each beat. At last, I forced myself upstairs. The hallway was still. The door to my stepsister's room was closed. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. The moment I pushed it open, the sound ceased. Inside, she lay unmoving, her breath steady, her body untouched. The silence that filled the room felt unnatural, as though it had swallowed the sound whole. The presence seemed to grow bolder with time. Radios clicked on by themselves. Old electronics warmed as if recently used. The television, ancient and abandoned, hummed faintly when I pressed my ear to it. I began to sense that the house wanted something, that the noises and movements were not random. They were deliberate, patient, waiting for acknowledgement. I resisted. I told myself not to speak, not to engage, but silence felt just as dangerous. Each time I ignored the footsteps, they grew louder. Each time I pretended not to feel the eyes, the pressure increased. The line between house and mind blurred. Even when I left, the feeling followed. On empty streets, I heard echoes of footsteps behind me. In unfamiliar bathrooms, I felt the same weight pressing into my back. It was as if the presence had attached itself to me, unwilling to be confined to walls. Sleep abandoned me. When I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the footsteps circling endlessly, never stopping. Sometimes I woke convinced the sound was still there, my heart racing as I listened for the rhythm in the silence. Sometimes I woke with the certainty that someone was standing at the foot of the bed, waiting for me to look. My father grew quieter. He moved through the house with caution, double-checking locks, leaving lights on. He never admitted fear, but it lived in his gestures, in the way his eyes darted toward corners. He had lived with it longer than I had. He knew better than me how persistent it was. I began to wonder if the presence was tied to the house or to us. Was it a remnant of something old, bound to the walls, or was it something that had chosen us, attached itself to our family? The footsteps were too deliberate, too human to dismiss as settling wood, but they were also too impossible to believe. The questions circled endlessly, but answers never came. Each time I thought I understood, the house shifted, revealing new strangeness. The footsteps moved to different rooms. The pressure in the bathroom grew stronger. Objects shifted more noticeably. What began as subtle intrusion became undeniable. One evening, I walked into the dining room and found 7 chairs around the table. I had always kept 6. I stood frozen, staring at the extra chair. It was placed neatly, as though waiting for someone to sit. My chest tightened. I backed away slowly, unable to look away from the symmetry broken by addition. The next morning, the chair was gone. I stopped trusting my senses. Each reflection felt like a lie, each shadow like a trick. I caught glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision, figures withdrawing into corners, hands sliding out of sight. Each time I turned, the room was empty. The worst moments were when I felt it directly. Sometimes in the upstairs hall, I sensed someone inches behind me. The air grew heavy, charged with static. My skin prickled, my breath caught. I never turned. I knew that if I looked, I would see something I could not unsee. I tried to leave early one morning, desperate to escape the weight of the house. As I closed the door, I heard the footsteps begin again upstairs, circling steadily. I froze on the porch, my heart hammering. The sound did not fade with distance. It followed, echoing faintly even as I walked away. By then, I no longer questioned whether it was real. The only question left was what it wanted. Sleep fractured entirely. I woke often to the sound of pacing, convinced that someone was walking the perimeter of my bed. My room would be heavy with silence, yet the impression of steps remained, vibrating through the mattress, circling me as though marking territory. Sometimes I opened my eyes to see the outline of a figure at the far end of the room, standing still, waiting. By the time I blinked, it was gone, but the pressure in the air remained. Days blurred into one another. I moved through them like a shadow myself, exhausted and brittle. Friends tried to reach me, to pull me back into routine, but I avoided them. How could I explain that I lived with someone unseen, that my nights were filled with footsteps and whispers? To speak it aloud felt like offering acknowledgement, and I could not risk giving the presence more power. The steps grew bolder still. They no longer confined themselves to the upstairs. One evening, as I sat at the table with my father, the sound began in the hallway behind us, heavy, steady, each one reverberating through the floorboards. My father froze, fork halfway to his mouth. We stared at one another, neither willing to speak. The steps passed the doorway and carried on into the kitchen. Yet when we followed moments later, the room was empty. The back door was locked. No footprints marked the dust by the threshold. The nights following that grew worse. I would lie awake listening as the steps traveled from room to room, exploring each space as if cataloging it. Sometimes they paused outside my door, lingering long enough for me to hold my breath, praying the knob would not turn. Sometimes they circled the living room endlessly, as though waiting for someone to join. I began to keep count. At first, it was to distract myself, to impose logic on what I could not control. 1, 2, 3, 4. Over and over, but soon the numbers betrayed me. I counted 6 one night, then 7, then 8, though only my father and I were in the house. Each time I tried to correct myself, the steps grew louder, mocking the futility of arithmetic. Numbers no longer balanced. The house insisted on addition. It was then that the voices began. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper at the edge of hearing. They carried no words I could recognize, only murmurs, hushed tones, as though two people were speaking just beyond a closed door. I pressed my ear to the walls, desperate to locate the source. Sometimes it seemed to come from the attic, sometimes from the basement, sometimes from just behind me. Each time I turned, silence consumed the space, leaving me dizzy with dread. The house never returned to silence. Even when it seemed quiet, even when the walls held still, there was always a pulse beneath it, a vibration that hinted at movement. After the night of the extra chair, I knew the presence no longer cared to remain hidden. It had shown its hand, made itself undeniable. I could pretend only for so long before the weight of it crushed every defense. The footsteps came earlier now, no longer confined to midnight. They stirred just before dawn, shaking me from restless sleep. The sound was heavier than before, strong enough to rattle the ceiling fan in the living room. The blades trembled against their mount as if struck by unseen wind, though the air remained still. My stepsister complained of waking suddenly, dragged from dreams by the noise circling her room. She told me that she felt as though someone were deliberately keeping her from rest. Each word from her mouth only confirmed what I already knew. It was not just the steps anymore. The entire house seemed alive. Doors that had been shut swung open with soft clicks. Radios powered on without human touch, spilling static into the silence. Old electronics hummed faintly, their coils warming as though in use. The upstairs television, ancient and abandoned, crackled to life one morning with a screen of snow, its glow spilling into the hall though no one had touched the switch. My father unplugged it himself, muttering that the wiring must have been faulty. Yet later that night the hum returned, stronger than before, the light seeping from the unplugged set like a wound. The bathroom upstairs grew unbearable. The sensation of being watched had once been tolerable, something I could endure in moments, but now it was suffocating. The air pressed down like a hand against my back. Each time I showered, the feeling sharpened until I swore I could hear breath that was not mine, shallow and insistent. I stopped going altogether. The room became forbidden space, a door I no longer touched, a part of the house claimed fully by something that was not us. My father admitted more openly then that he too had felt it for years. He confessed to avoiding that same bathroom, to walking faster in the upstairs hallway, to leaving lights on because darkness no longer felt safe. He said he had ignored it, convinced himself it was tricks of age and imagination, until I returned and confirmed what he had always suspected. Hearing his words brought no comfort. Instead, it deepened the fear. If he had lived with it for so long without resolution, what chance did I have of escaping? The strangest part was how the presence followed me beyond the house. I began to hear footsteps in places they did not belong, echoes down empty streets, patterns in hotel corridors, faint impressions in stairwells. They came at odd hours, just as the first light of morning cracked the horizon or just as the night reached its stillest point. Always the same rhythm, deliberate, heavy, patient. The sensation of being watched grew too. Mirrors became unbearable. I avoided them as much as possible because too often I caught glimpses of movement behind me. Not faces, not forms, just shadows leaning too close, shapes withdrawing when I turned. Even when nothing was there, the certainty lingered that something had been. My stepsister confessed she had heard them too. She said she often woke to faint conversations outside her door, voices that stopped the instant she sat up. She said she had even called out once, demanding to know who was there, only for the house to reply with silence. She had begun to sleep with music playing, desperate to drown the whispers. The presence no longer confined itself to sound. I began to feel the brush of fingers against my arm when no one was near. I felt pressure at the foot of my bed, as though someone had sat there, testing the mattress. I woke one night to find the blanket pulled halfway down my body, my skin exposed to the cold air. My father admitted to similar experiences, though he spoke of them only once before retreating into silence again. By then, I no longer doubted that we were living with something not of us. What unsettled me most was that it seemed to grow stronger the more we noticed it. The more fear we carried, the more deliberate it became. It was as though our attention fed it, each glance and shiver adding weight to its presence. The climax came one early morning, just before dawn. I woke to the sound of footsteps directly above me, circling rapidly. The ceiling fan shook violently, its blades clattering against their mount. My heart pounded as I listened, waiting for the sound to stop. But instead of fading, it descended. The steps moved down the hall, closer and closer, until they stopped outside my door. The knob rattled, once, twice, then stilled. I held my breath, every muscle rigid. For long minutes, silence filled the air. Then came the whisper, pressed against the crack of the door, low, urgent, indecipherable. I clutched the blanket to my chest, refusing to move. Eventually, the whisper ceased and the steps retreated, but I knew then that it had been real, not imagination, not the shifting of wood. Something had stood there, waiting, speaking to me in words I could not understand. After that night, I no longer felt alone in any sense. Even in crowded places, I sensed it near, weaving through strangers, brushing past shoulders. It no longer confined itself to the house or to silence. It had followed me fully, tethered itself to me in ways I cannot undo. I do not know what it wants, perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps fear, perhaps something worse. What I do know is that it has patience. It does not rush. It lingers, circles, waits. Each day I wonder if tonight will be the night it finally reveals itself fully. Each morning I wake surprised to find I still draw breath, uncertain of how long that will last. I write this not for comfort, but for record. If someday the footsteps stop, if someday the whispers fall silent, do not assume the presence is gone. Absence does not mean departure. It means waiting. It means hiding in places we cannot see. The last sound I heard as I write this was the creak of floorboards outside my door. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the seventh.